Yay! That was, okay, that's what we like to hear. So this is, I hate to use the word last because we are going to continue to have conversations about race at the new school, but it certainly is our last formal class of this university lecture elective course. But it is far, far from least because we very intentionally, I shouldn't say we, I very intentionally said, let's end with voting rights. And the reason for that is probably fairly obvious. Yes, Chrissy, don't you think? Which is, it's very difficult to understand the history of race in the United States without thinking about the history of how we decide who has one of the most primary forms of citizenship, which is the ability to vote for who our elected leaders are. And it's a deeply fraught history in this country, and with very, very present day implications. So we are not only going to talk about history, but we won't be ignoring it, particularly when it comes to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But really understanding what the implications are for the past presidential election and the midterms coming up, and how we should be thinking about it and what we should be doing about it. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce, I'll start all the way on my left, which is Christina Greer, who's an associate professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University. Her primary research interests are racial and ethnic politics, American urban centers, presidential politics, and campaigns and elections. And Professor Greer's book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, was published by Oxford University Press in 2013, and investigates the increasingly ethnically diverse Black populations in the US and Africa and the Caribbean, and was the recipient of the W.B. Du Bois Best Book Award in 2014 by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. And Chrissy's a friend. You are a friend, most importantly, and someone who's very, very active in politics, not just as an academic. And it is also my great privilege to introduce another friend. I don't know whether they'd own me, but I'll own them. So Ari Berman, who, in my view, has been doing some of the most in-depth, comprehensive, and incisive reporting on what's been happening with voting and voting rights in this country in the past few years. Ari is now a senior reporter at Mother Jones, covering voting rights, and a reporting fellow at the Nation Institute. He's the author of Give Us the Ballot. Note for future university lectures that the three of these faculty members are engaged in. If you sign up for credit, we get you swag. So for those of you who are taking this course for credit, we got you some swag. But it's a very, very important book along with Chrissy's. So Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. He's also the author of Herding Donkeys. I don't know if that's harder than cats, but the fight to rebuild the Democratic Party and reshape American politics. He won a 2017 Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media. Both of them are on Twitter, and you should follow them because they drop knowledge on the daily. But I really wanted to open it up. We're going to do this informal style like we did last week's class. And remind the audience, we will come back and do a Q&A, most definitely. But we're going to do this informally. And I actually wanted to just open, I'm just going to open, it's not even a question. Because I know you all have something to say without a question. Well, you know, I know, both of you do. But it's always smart. Yesterday, as you know, Donald Trump, or day before yesterday, went to Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, to the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson. And Margaret Burnham, who's a very important civil rights activist, was a member of SNCC, actually wrote a piece. And I just want to read the first paragraph. On June 5th, 1964, a few weeks before the murder of Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman in Neshoba, Mississippi, I sent my mother a letter from Jackson, Mississippi. With other staff members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I was preparing for the launch of our Freedom Summer project that would bring hundreds of college students into the state to help register voters, run freedom schools, and pry open the closed society. Our office on Lynch Street, a glass storefront, was hectic and tense. 2 nights ago, I wrote, we got all of our front windows broken again, second time in 3 days. We were all in the office, and one girl got hit kind of bad with a brick. The solution we arrived at was to plywood up the whole front of the windows. But we haven't gotten around to it yet, and people have to stay up all night in the office because there is no way of locking it. It was pedestrian and quotidian, but those are the seeds from which history sprouts, and that is the history that presumably the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum seeks to capture and honor. It is a history trump he who worships at the altar of Charlottesville's statue of Robert E. Lee, and who loves the amazing things Fred Douglass is doing, will brutalize, deform, and defame on Saturday when he attends the opening of the museum. It is likewise a history that is not for sale. Not for sale because the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer soars higher than that of Mississippi's Governor Phil Bryant. Not for sale because the blood of George Lee, killed for voting 1955, Lamar Smith, killed for voting 1955, and Herbert Lee, killed for voting 1961, seeping out of its doors and into the streets, cannot be contained in this or any other museum.
So I see the Voting Rights Act, the Civil. Let me just make sure it's on. So I see the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Immigration Act as a triumvirate of acts to be taken as one. I think the moment that we're in right now is a systematic attempt to roll back all three. So we know that the Civil Rights Act was passed in '64, Voting Rights and Immigration Acts were passed in '65, with some other acts, housing acts and things like that, to really uplift and protect a lot of American citizens and bring them into the fold and on some sort of parity after hundreds of years of either chattel slavery or various forms of exclusion by the state, deliberate forms of exclusion. And so we're in a moment right now where when we see, and Ari's written about this extensively, in the 2016 elections, leaving Russia aside, this is the first time that we're going back to the polls without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act in so many states. And so when we think about trying to build walls and have Muslim bans and taking away voting rights for citizens, formerly incarcerated individuals, just poor people, the elderly, people without IDs, and making it even more difficult to vote, we know that voting fraud just quite honestly doesn't exist. We have a problem where we actually don't have enough people to vote, right? In a highly contested presidential election, we can barely get 60%. So it's not like we have people Chicago style, 1920s voting early and often and multiple times. That's just, it's not true. And so we're in a moment where we have to look at what's happening to our larger civil rights, because in a moment of chaos where everything is being thrown around, you can get really distracted and not fully understand sort of some of the systems that are in play. And this is not hyperbolic, this is not conspiracy theories. We can look at real laws and real practices that are happening in states that aren't just the South, right? We like to always point to Mississippi and Alabama as the problem places, but as I like to remind people, as Malcolm X said, anything south of the Canadian border is the US South. And we can look at states and they behave as such. So obviously Wisconsin and Michigan are two states that are bad, have bad behavior. But we even know that in New York City in the Board of Elections, we had bad behavior during the presidential primaries. So I'm a little worried. I'm worried because we haven't resolved some of the issues of 2016. I'm worried that we've excavated some of the worst behavior, racialized, from the 1960s. So when you were reading that passage, I sort of zoned out and I couldn't remember. I was like, is she talking about 1965 or is she talking about the election that's happening next week? Because these are the things that are actually happening on a daily basis. So I'll pause there because I want to hear what Ari has to say, but we can go back.
Yeah, and if Ari, part of why I read that passage was it's also the importance of history in understanding where we are today and what's happening today. So that I'm hoping you'll also reflect on that history as it relates to today.
Well, I mean, we're in such an unbelievably retrenchment moment when it comes to civil rights in this country. I mean, there have been presidents in previous lifetimes, in my lifetime, who have been bad on civil rights, but I don't know if there's been anyone in, I don't know how far you have to go back, who's run so explicitly against civil rights as Donald Trump has. And I ended up tweeting quite a bit about the visit to Mississippi because I don't know why I'm shocked by anything these days, but I still was just like so shocked. Like, you're going to a museum in Mississippi after you called white supremacists very fine people, and you attacked John Lewis right before your inauguration, and you hired a white supremacist as your chief strategist, and you refused to rent to black people, and were sued by the Nixon administration. The Nixon administration, who barely enforced civil rights laws, sued Donald Trump for violating the Fair Housing Act. So, I mean, it's all so amazing, but that's the moment we're living in, and you just kind of reflect back on what Mississippi was like. And I know it'll be chronicled in that museum, but I mean, only 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There were counties in Mississippi where there wasn't a single black registered voter. I mean, it started out talking about, that article started talking about Andrew Goodman and James Chaney and Michael Schwerner, one of whom, James Chaney, was from Mississippi, two of whom were from New York and went down to Mississippi for Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. But they were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan simply because they wanted to help people register to vote. So that's our history, and that's basically just 50 years ago. And just thinking about the state next door to Mississippi in Alabama, which is going to have an election tomorrow. I mean, when you say the past is
to
never
replace Jeff Sessions, who was not exactly a friend to civil rights.
To say it's Jefferson Beauregard.
Jefferson Beauregard Sessions.
Because you're named after two white supremacists, right? Not just one. And I think that's really I think it's really important to realize Jefferson Beauregard Sessions is named after two historical white supremacists in this nation. He upheld some really excruciatingly painful laws against black people specifically, so much so that in 1986, when Coretta Scott King wrote the letter that said he cannot be a judge. I mean, he just does not have sort of any sort of moral core when it comes to civil rights. And she essentially won that small battle. And then fast forward 30 some odd years, he is the most powerful law enforcement individual in the United States.
Well, okay, so I shouldn't have said Jeff Sessions, because it's also, as a U.S. attorney in Alabama, when groups were organizing around voting drives, he actually was asked to investigate to protect civil rights and flipped it into a criminal investigation of whether community organizers were actually using the registration process for fraudulent purposes. I was actually working with one of the groups that had been under investigation, and it was astounding, to say the least. And okay, so sorry, Ari.
No, anyway, so what I was that was a good point about Jeff Sessions, but just to pick up on it, I mean, there's this, obviously everyone's following the election in Alabama tomorrow, but I mean, it's amazing leave aside the behavior of Roy Moore, which should have disqualified any reasonable candidate. But just in terms of the rhetoric about Roy Moore that hasn't even gotten any attention, like he's just said a few days ago that he wanted to stop after the 10th Amendment. Meaning there would have been no 13th Amendment, no 14th Amendment, no 15th Amendment, no 19th Amendment. I mean, I think if you guys are taking this class, hopefully you know what some of those are, but that would mean, no abolition of slavery, and no right to vote for black men, no right to vote for women. I mean, the Constitution literally would have stopped before we would have achieved any of those things. And then Alabama's Secretary of State was on Twitter about a month ago, and he said, I don't know of a single instance in the history of our state where any qualified voter has been disenfranchised. And this is Alabama. This was a state that had poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and lynchings. In Selma, Alabama, if you wanted to register to vote and you're African American, you had to name all 67 county judges to try to register to vote in 1965, a test that was applied to African Americans, but almost never to whites, sometimes to poor whites, but never to affluent ones. And so it's just amazing to me, reflecting on history, there's either just a total lack of understanding of history or a very acute understanding of history and a refusal to acknowledge it or actually to warp it for political purposes.
And I think we're pretty ahistoric as a nation. But what we have to remember, and I always try and remind folks, is that Black people have only been voting under the full protection of the United States for a little over 50 years, right? And so even that's
and the full protection might be a little debatable.
Yeah, and I'm putting an asterisk on that, right? Because even talking to my dad over Thanksgiving, he remembers when his parents tried to vote in Florida, and some of the literacy tests were, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Exactly. It's a ridiculous question, right? Or questions that essentially have no answers. And these are for people who were brave enough to even go to the building, because oftentimes people who tried ended up lynched. And we know that lynching also, as Ida B. Wells tells us, wasn't just random lynchings. It was usually people in a community who had some sort of economic prowess as well. So these are long-standing issues that many of the people who engaged in this behavior are still around and still in power. And so some of this rollback that is somewhat spectacular, they were young when they tried it the first time, and now they're older and a little bit wiser, and they have the full support of a president to do so.
So let's fast forward this conversation, because I think the history is both deep. Alabama also was a state that literally had segregation in its constitution. And modern day fights, which required votes because they were state referenda, to try to get that language out of the state constitution. So, it's also local elections run deep in this as well. But when we fast forward to the presidential election, and we think about what voting retrenchment we've had and its impacts on the election, what are and I know we've all had this conversation a number of times. So, Chrissy, I'd love it if you would talk about the demographics of voting and some of the things that demographics underscores in terms of race and gender. And Ari, if you would also talk about it in terms of the impact of, undermining the Voting Rights Act.
And just as a footnote to what you said about Alabama, they're closing down 35 DMVs, all of them in districts that have a 75% or more Black population, just coincidentally.
Which means if you need the ID and you make it very difficult to get to the place where you can get the ID, and you can say you have the opportunity to vote, but then it serves as nothing more than similar to a poll tax. And the same thing has been happening in Texas. There's some areas in which you literally have to travel for 2 hours to get to a DMV that's open twice a week. And if you're a wage earner, what does that mean for your wages? You don't get paid. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the demographics. So 2016, we're still analyzing it. I have some strong feelings about the Democratic Party and their perpetual need to chase this working class voter. They keep calling it the working class voter, but we know that they mean working class white male voter, right? Because last I checked, there were lots of working class Black and Latino folks from across the country. But they mean working class white voters, people who have not voted democratically in about 20 years. So here's the secret, Tom Perez. They're not coming back, right? Get over them. Why don't you love the one you're with? Maybe the 94% of Black women who showed up to the polls and actually delivered the votes on the local, state, and national levels. For some reason, the Democratic Party refuses to recognize Black women as the keepers of big D Democratic politics. There's always this thing that people talk about called the gender gap, right? Which is women vote one way, usually Democratic, and men vote another way, usually Republican. What we have found is that there's actually not really a gender gap, right? White women vote Republican. They have. Since 1952 to 2016, there have only been 2 presidential elections where white women did not vote for the Republican candidate. So in 64, white women voted in a majority for the Democrat. That was LBJ, as you all should know, right? And of course, the whole country was in the era of, sort of supporting the president. And then in 1996, sort of peaked Bill Clinton, but before the scandals, the additional scandals. But white women have a long history of voting for the Republican candidate in presidential elections, and even on local elections. So with these demographics, it's women are sort of the Democrats. It's like, no, women are not the Democrats. Black and Latina women are the Democrats. White women are the Republicans, actually. And so Democrats keep chasing this invisible white male that's left. Take Georgia, for instance. They're finally coming up with a strategy where they're saying, you know what? White men have actually been voting for the Republican gubernatorial candidates for the past, white, formerly registered Democrats, for the past 20 years. Maybe this time, if we actually want a Democratic governor, maybe we shouldn't spend all of our time, money, and energy trying to woo them back to the party. Since we haven't been successful in 2 decades, maybe we should actually get the Democrats who are already registered, who are consistently ignored during the midterm elections. And so we see that time and time again, that in presidential election years, everyone wants to throw money into particular communities and say, hey, Black and Latino folks, come on out and vote for the Democratic candidate. But in a 2017 or 2018, they're virtually ignored. So just to go back to Alabama really quickly with demographics, the narrative is already being set up that if Doug Jones loses, it's the Black folks' fault, right? Black folks aren't going to come out for Doug Jones. What have the Democrats ever done to really invest sort of in off-year elections in people who aren't white, realistically? And they fail at that. So during the presidential election, we have a candidate who is just not liked, right, by a very large percentage of the population. And if the Democrats were paying attention in 2007, when essentially a Black man out of nowhere, whose middle name is Hussein and his last name rhymes with Osama, can knock off the most powerful Democratic family in the latter 20th, early 21st century, out of nowhere, as dynamic and clean and shiny, to quote Joe Biden, as he may be, right? But he was able to do that. So maybe Hillary Clinton isn't the one, right? And so then 8 years later, we have a coronation. But I think there was an assumption that white women would automatically be drawn to this other white woman. And if we looked historically, again, as an ahistoric nation, we would know that white women aren't just automatically drawn to a female candidate, and they're definitely not necessarily drawn to this particular candidate.
There was that one great. You all may have seen this. This was I just use this anecdotally because there were white racists who voted for Obama. There were, and I think that it's about 1/4 of whites who didn't even think blacks and whites should date each other still supported Obama for president. And there's this great anecdote from a black canvasser out of Boston in 2008 who knocks on a door, and a white woman answers the door, and he says, I'm out here canvassing. I want to know if you're going to vote and if you know who you're going to vote for. And she says, sure, wait 1 minute. And she turns around and she says, honey, who are we voting for in the presidential election? Okay, problem number one, right? Who are we voting for? Asking her husband to tell her. But and then he shouts back, not seeing who is standing at the front door, we're voting for that nigger. All right, that's actually a true story. So just to complicate it.
Well, but I think also, a little bit of the reverse Bradley effect happened in 2008 because a lot of women do vote with their husbands or how their husbands vote. Not my husband, because I'm the political scientist. So he says, honey, who are we voting for? But the Bradley effect was when Mayor Bradley, a black man, was mayor of Los Angeles, and he ran for governor of California. And everyone said, I'm voting for Bradley, 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 Bradley. And when the returns came in, no one voted for Bradley. So lots of people, Democratic strategists, were definitely concerned that Obama would have this Bradley effect, where everybody said they were voting for Obama, and then no one was going to vote for a man whose middle name was Hussein and last name rhymed with Osama. But the reverse actually happened, and largely, I think, because of Sarah Palin. There were so many women Republican women, who actually told their husbands that they were definitely voting for John McCain, but in certain places across the country, they actually just could not bring themselves to vote for a Sarah Palin on the ticket because John McCain was of a certain age, and so there was a probability that he might not make it through the 4 years. So they actually lied and said they voted for McCain, and they secretly voted for the black man.
Man, Sarah Palin.
Remember her?
Remember her?
Well, she's
Remember
the one
when
who
she was the worst
kickstarted
thing in
this
American
whole thing.
politics? Yeah. So just to pick up on what Chrissy said about the demographics. I mean, if you look, there were 5 million new voters that cast a ballot in 2008. And of those 5 million new voters, 2 million were African American, 2 million were Latino, and 600,000 were Asian American. So virtually the entire growth in the electorate came from people of color. And they voted 75% for President Obama. And I think this really set off alarm bells among Republicans because this coalition was described as the coalition of the ascendant. It was the fastest growing demographics in the country. They were voting in record numbers for the first black president. And what were you going to do about it? And there was some thought that Republicans might try to change their policies to reach out to these voters. We very, very quickly realized that would not happen. So then in 2010, the next election after Obama, when Democrats cratered and Republicans picked up these huge majorities in state legislatures across the country, including a lot of very important swing states, basically the first thing they did in all of these states was introduce and pass laws to make it harder to vote when nobody was really paying attention and nobody really knew what these laws were. So nobody really knew about voter ID laws or cutting early voting or purging the voting rolls or making it harder to register to vote. I mean, there had been gerrymandering all of the state lines, because of course all of the gerrymandering happened after the 2010 election when the new census came out. So this was kind of a perfect storm for Republicans in terms of being able to first win a wave election, gerrymander the lines to keep power, and then pass voter suppression laws to maintain those majorities indefinitely. And so that all happened after the 2010 election. That's when I started paying attention to voter suppression. And then in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled that those states with the longest histories of discrimination no longer had to approve their voting changes with the federal government. So you already had existing voter suppression efforts going on in states that had nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act up north. And then you had all of these states in the South and some in the West that could put new voter suppression measures in effect for the first time without federal approval. So just to give one example of the kind of things that we saw. So a month after the Supreme Court guts the Voting Rights Act, North Carolina, which had the most progressive voting laws in the South and actually far more progressive voting laws than we have in New York right now, passed this really sweeping rewrite of their election laws. And they required strict ID, which hundreds of thousands of people didn't have. They cut early voting. They eliminated same-day voter registration. They eliminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, which was taught in high schools. They eliminated Citizens Awareness Month, which the state of North Carolina ran to encourage people to register to vote. All of this in one bill, just a month after the Supreme Court said voting discrimination is largely a thing of the past. And so last year, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals wrote this really remarkable opinion striking down these laws. And the court said that North Carolina targeted black voters, in the court's words, with almost surgical precision. And they said this was the worst voting law in North Carolina since Jim Crow. And some of the details which they pulled out were really, really interesting. So, for example, North Carolina eliminated voting on the Sundays before an election. And we don't have early voting in New York, which we can talk about, but those states that do have early voting, Sunday's a very convenient day to vote because a lot of people aren't working, and that's when black churches hold Souls to the Polls voter mobilization drive. So this has shown that this is something that really works to boost turnout. So the court asked North Carolina, well, why did you eliminate Sunday voting? And North Carolina said, well, some people were using it more than others. And the court said, okay, well, just curious, who is using it more than others? And North Carolina said, counties with a large African-American population that voted Democratic. And the court said, you just admitted to us in federal court that you did this to disenfranchise people based on their party, but more significantly based on their race. And this just goes to show you that, you know, we're in a new version of a very old battle, that things have gotten more sophisticated in terms of what you're doing. You can't just outright block people from voting, but you can do subtle things like eliminate voting on the Sunday before the election, or require IDs and then close the DMVs where you get the IDs. Those are the kind of things we're seeing now that are more subtle, less obviously racist, but when you dig deeper down, you see the same effect. The other thing I'll say is one of the most disturbing things to me is someone who grew up in the North was just how some of these efforts have spread to the North. And so I was in Wisconsin on election day, and I've been there subsequently. And Wisconsin was one of these states that had a strict voter ID law. And when the law was passed, 9% of registered voters didn't have the strict forms of ID that were required, meaning a Wisconsin driver's license or photo ID. And Wisconsin was interesting to me because it was a state that had a very long history of high voter turnout. So even though Wisconsin had a lot of problems, Milwaukee was known as the Selma of the North because of civil rights problems in the 1960s, the state still had a consistently very, very high voter turnout and very progressive voting laws. And When this voter ID law went into effect in 2016, turnout in Wisconsin dropped by 3% in the last election. And turnout particularly fell in black parts of the state, particularly in Milwaukee, which is the largest concentration of African American voters. And I talked to a number of people who weren't able to vote, a number of election officials that thought this had a big impact on the election. And after the election, there was a study by the University of Wisconsin, and they surveyed people who didn't vote. And 1 in 10 non-voters cited the state's voter ID law as a reason why they didn't cast a ballot, which meant that up to 23,000 people were blocked from voting in 2 counties alone, in Madison and Milwaukee, the 2 most Democratic parts of the state. Donald Trump only won the state by 22,000 votes. And part of my reason for going to Wisconsin after the election was because I was so annoyed with the narratives coming out that there was just a total lack of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton, or the only reason that black people didn't vote was because Barack Obama wasn't on the ballot. And I just knew that there were people out there from my own reporting that wanted to vote, that tried to vote, and they couldn't. And I thought that narrative was just totally invisible in the wake of the election.
Yeah, and can we talk a little bit about those margins? Because, I think one of the things that got lost, putting aside that Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million of the popular votes. So the other thing is the only way this outcome happens is another slave, historical vestige of racism in the United States, which is the Electoral College, which I don't know if you all want to say anything about, but, critically important to understand that the outcome would be different if we did not have the Electoral College to begin with.
But as the political scientist, I'm going to throw in a little. This is always unpopular. But
no, you're supposed to be unpopular. It's a class.
I'm so used to being popular. But here's the thing with the Electoral College. There are 3 times in American history where it hasn't worked, right? One time is in the 1800s, and, who knows what kind of mechanisms they were using. So, we'll put that one on the shelf. 2000 with George Bush and Al Gore, right? And it was super close, 269, 271. Shouldn't have been that close. But I always try and remind people. Hanging chads. I always remind people, my sister and I are very close. If my sister were the governor of Florida and I just happened to be running for president, and the one state that's a question mark is my sister's state, I kind of feel like she'd move heaven and earth to make sure I won that state, fair or square. And we know that there were so many instances of voter suppression and straight up voter fraud that happened in 2000. So that was an instance where, we had a few days or several days where we just didn't know who the president-elect was. But that one I give an asterisk because we had the weird Supreme Court case. It's 5-4, but as the legal mind, that they wrote the court case and then they said, and don't ever replicate this one again. This is like a one and done. We're just going to write this case, but don't ever make it precedent, right? So, and this was, I just feel like that was a little odd. So I put an asterisk on 2000. So then that brings us to 2016, which, yes, this is where the popular vote says one thing, it's 3 million more votes than the Electoral College because of geography, where people are moving, voter suppression, throwing people off the scrolls. So if in subsequent elections we see this discrepancy between the popular vote and the Electoral College, I do think that we need to revisit it pretty significantly. But if we don't, then this has been the system that has delivered Barack Obama and LBJ and Bill Clinton and all these other people that Democrats have been really happy about. So the one time that it doesn't, I don't know if we should just say it's a racist system. Everything in America is a racist system. Every single law we have is built on sort of some sort of racist precedent. So the Electoral College is just sort of part and parcel of that's American democracy.
So
is the goal.
So I'm gonna push you a little bit on this point from a solution standpoint, not because your factual points are wrong, but it goes to the issue of when you have systemic problems, you need multiple fixes to fix the system. And as some people are now organizing these strategies to ask that states, you being the political scientists know this better than I, but ask for states to pass or adopt legislation that says the Electoral College votes will go to and track the popular vote, because there's nothing that prohibits that as one of the strategies of reform. But to your point, certainly not the only one, because it doesn't take care of this very real and deep endemic problem. But are you suggesting that is not something that you think is worthy of time and attention?
I feel like I'd rather put our energies and efforts elsewhere. I also worry just because there's so many state houses. The vast majority of state houses are Republican controlled. The vast majority of governorships are Republican controlled. And I'm not putting this all on Republicans for voter suppression. I mean, they do a very good job at it. But, there are a lot of Democrats who are quite happy knowing who they vote for because so many districts are so blue or so red. The real action is in the primary. And so there are many Democrats who are just fine making sure that folks don't get to the polls because you might actually vote for my primary opponent.
Well, I think the thing that I'm concerned about is that basically we have majorities through minority rule now. That between the Electoral College, we have a president who lost the popular vote. We have a U.S. Senate where someone's vote in Wyoming matters 66 times more than someone's vote in California because of the way the U.S. Senate is set up. We have a situation where in states like Wisconsin, Democrats are getting a majority of the vote, but not a minority of seats, like a third of seats in state legislatures because of gerrymandering. We have people that are elected because of voter suppression. So I think it all kind of adds up to wondering just how democratic our democratic system really is right now because of all of these things. And maybe we can overcome one of them, like we can overcome the Electoral College, but like it's a lot harder to overcome the gerrymandering. And the Senate, we're probably never going to overcome. It's going to have good or bad days, but it's always going to give more power to states like Wyoming and Nebraska. I think in terms of the numbers, one of the things we've just kind of, in a way, become okay with the fact that a lot of people just can't vote. And not only that, but aren't even participating in the first place. So a quarter of Americans aren't even registered to vote, meaning they're just completely invisible throughout the entire campaign. They're not being polled, most likely. They're not being contacted by the campaigns because they're not, quote unquote, likely voters. They just basically don't exist, even though we know the people that are not registered are more likely to be progressive leaning voters. They're more likely to be younger. They're more likely to be lower income. They're more likely to be people of color that if they got registered, that would have a big impact on political power. And then if you just look at the numbers, 12% of all Americans had at least one problem voting in the last election, according to an MIT study, meaning they encountered long lines, or they had a problem registering, or they couldn't find their polling place. This is people who voted. Then there were 1 million people that couldn't vote because of election administration issues, meaning the line was too long, or they couldn't register to vote, or they didn't have the right ID, one reason or another, or they lived in a state like New York, which you can only vote on election day, and they were out of town, and they didn't have an excuse, or they didn't get it together in time to print out a form from the Board of Elections, send it to the Board of Elections, have the form sent back to them, pay for the postage, and then send it back, which is what I did. It was easier for me to buy a car than it was to vote in New York City. So, I mean, there's any number of reasons
Probably easier to get a gun.
people, it was certainly easier to get a gun, just walk into Walmart. And so like 1 million people had problems voting or didn't vote at all. And the election was decided by 78,000 votes in 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So such a small number of votes. In a country of 300 million people, the election was decided by fewer than 70,000 votes in 3 states.
I think that goes back to, though, this hypertenure that we see among elected officials, both Democratic and Republican. So in the vast majority of state houses, you can stay there forever. And there's a real incentive for Democrats and Republicans to make sure that these people, these 25%, that they aren't introduced, especially if they're low-income people of color from particular areas, because those would be the people who would vote out a Democrat. Right? And so you see someone like John Conyers, who's been in office for 53 years. He's won 27 elections. A voting rights activist, he is not, right? Because he knows the folks who show up whether it's June or September, however they vote in Michigan, he knows who's coming. It's the little old ladies who voted for him when he first joined Congress and started the CBC with Charlie Rangel and Shirley Chisholm. I mean, like, that's how entrenched so many of these individuals are.
So gerrymandering, let's say a little bit more about that, and then I want to talk about felony disenfranchisement and Virginia, and then implications for the midterm elections. But so, I mean, because you all kind of have already gone directly into the gerrymandering point, but we also have a lot of bad Supreme Court precedent on
but could have
gerrymandering
some
as
good
well.
stuff. Yeah.
But and some good stuff. So, what, if any, focus should we be having on gerrymandering specifically as solutions to some of our voting problems? Because we've talked about the end that relates to making it more difficult to vote, but
Right.
then of course there's also the roadblock of incumbents, no matter which party, to
Right.
breaking open more opportunities.
Well, I went to gerrymandering camp this summer, so full disclosure. And you all can also go to gerrymandering camp.
That sounds so fun.
It was really
Who
great.
needs to go to a lake? Who needs to go to gerrymandering?
Imagine like 800 mathematicians and political scientists for a full week just talking about nothing but gerrymandering. But I mean, my big thing that I've talked to my Congress class about and that I've been trying to, ring the alarm about is really filling out the census. And so,
Okay,
Well, so
and
there
I,
will
yeah,
I
gotta get
teach
to that.
broadband and universal broadband access, and that's a whole nother angle to how people are going to be actually undercounted because
Yeah.
communities of color in particular don't even have access to the tools
to the
for this
tools.
census.
Well, also, there's a real concern with this particular administration. And so, one, we're 3 years behind in the planning of the census. We don't really have a proper head. It's
Underfunded.
completely not funded properly, so it's going to be a disaster. That's one.
And it will be
Two,
online.
Hmm?
And it will be online.
And it'll be online, and the digital divide is real. But two, the census is mandated in the Constitution, right? And we know, if you've ever read the Constitution, which hopefully all of you have, it's a relatively thin document, right? A lot of the action is in the Federalist Papers and sort of, subsequent amendments. But like the Constitution's kind of like, it's a bare bones document. Like fill in the blanks later on. We don't know who's coming, right? But one of the things that they made sure to put in the Constitution was that we must take stock of who is in this country every 10 years. And at this moment in time, I can't in good conscience tell families who have undocumented loved ones living with them or sort of in the city, I can't tell them that I know for a fact that this administration won't use this information against them. It has never been used against folks before that I know of. It is literally just sort of the data about the data. We just need raw numbers, like who's here, age, race, sex, sort of geographic location. This particular administration, because it needs whiteness, so that means you also have to deport people of color, right? So that's what the Muslim ban's about. That's what the wall is about. That's what expelling 80,000 Haitians is about. Like at a certain point in time, you can't create new white people, right? So you let the Irish become white, you let the Italians become white, you let the Jews become white in certain circumstances. We're seeing that that's a little shaky, right? But like the Germans and all these other groups. But at a certain point in time, there are no more phenotypically white people that you can make white in this country. And so if you are worried about that percentage dwindling. They always talk about Latinos are going to be X percent by 2050, right? Latinos are already the second largest group ahead of Black Americans. If you can't do that, I'm really worried that this administration will take this information to figure out where said people of color are. So if people don't fill out the census, they also don't get resources that they need desperately for their communities. Schools, roads, insert whatever it may be, police. I don't really think we need police, but that's a whole nother panel. I think we do all right.
That was last week.
Okay, that was last week. I think we're fine. But yeah, that's a whole nother. So I really want people to fill out the census, but I also can't. I feel really badly almost encouraging people to fill out the census because in this moment in time, see previous conversation from 45 minutes ago, this particular administration that is obsessed with rolling back civil rights may use it for more sinister purposes.
So I want to give you a chance just to weigh in on gerrymandering, but then let's turn to midterms because, this is also something that may be implicated in terms of what our strategies are, what we suggest to people based on midterm elections.
Well, the gerrymandering stuff is so interesting to me because I mean, like you used to talk about like gerrymandering to people, and like their eyes would just like glaze over, like here we go again, gerrymandering. And now people are like going to gerrymandering camp. Like it's crazy, like how many people just get so nerded out about gerrymandering, and they find it so fascinating. Just want to talk about gerrymandering for a week. But I think there is a realization that like this stuff really does shape kind of everything in American politics. And this is one rare instance where there is a possibility of some good stuff happening from the Supreme Court. And in fact, some good stuff has already happened. So in the last round of redistricting, what Republicans did, and I don't want to get too technical here, but basically they took districts that were already majority minority districts. So districts that were already electing a Black or Latino Democrat. And Republicans put more African Americans or Latinos into those districts to make sure that the rest of the districts were as white as possible. Packing. The Supreme Court has actually struck that down in a bunch of different states. They've struck it down in North Carolina, in Virginia, and Alabama. They said, you can't do that. So that's been one positive on racial gerrymandering. So then Republicans have made a different argument, which is, oh, we didn't put all of those African Americans or Latinos into those districts for racial reasons. We did it for political reasons because they were Democrats. That's the new argument they're making, that they were just Democrats, so that's why it was done. And so now there's a case out of Wisconsin. There's going to be another case out of Maryland, which is challenging the partisan aspect of this, which is, okay, you can't pack, or the other word is crack, which you when you spread everyone out. You can't pack or crack people based on race, but you can do it because of party. And now the Supreme Court's weighing whether to say the partisanship angle isn't okay either, meaning that you can't just prevent someone from having representation if they're a Republican in New York or they're a Democrat in Texas. That there has to be some basic fairness for everyone here. And I'm never really that hopeful about what the Supreme Court will do, but I think this is one small example of something where I think we could get a good decision. I think it could have big ramifications because we're coming up on a whole nother redistricting cycle after the 2020 election. Now, it will be based on the 2020 census, which I have a lot of concerns in as well, and I'm currently investigating at this moment. But basically, I think we're going to see some, to the midterms, I think we're going to see some big Democratic pickups in 2018. I think they'll be less than they should be because of gerrymandering, but we'll still see some pickups. Then I think the 2020 elections will happen in a presidential year, which will be different because 2010 was an off-year election. 2020 will be a presidential election when Donald Trump theoretically is on the ballot again. So you'd imagine Democrats will still be enthused to vote. And then you're talking about a very different dynamic in a lot of state races, and we could see potentially a Virginia effect carry over. We'll see what happens, but we could see that.
I think 2018 will be important not just for the seats in Washington, D.C., but obviously state legislatures. So if people aren't split ticket voting, then, historically we've always seen that first election, post-presidential election, the opposing party picks up quite a few seats. That's just Americans prefer divided government. Right now we're in a moment of unified government. Doesn't really feel like it, but that means unified government means the president, my intro students are here, you all know this, right? The president's party is the same as the party in Congress. So the House is Republican, the Senate's Republican, and the president's Republican. They haven't had any legislative wins as of yet. We'll see how this tax bill shakes out just because of their own factions. But I think in 2018, Democrats theoretically will be galvanized to go to the polls. I think some weak-leaning Republicans will be galvanized to go to the polls, and some independents who we chase every 4 years for some reason. And they're either weak-leaning Republicans or weak-leaning Democrats. They just like attention. So, just kidding, if you're an independent, sure. But I think in 2018, we will see some mobilization, just because, at least right now, this moment is such that many people are disturbed about local politics, national politics, but also international politics and what their elected official in DC is actually doing. So the good thing is, because of all the chaos, there are people who are paying attention for the first time who probably didn't pay attention before. We have a real crisis in civic education. So as I already mentioned, people who get to register to vote at 16 and 17, they're also getting a lesson in civic education to understand about local, state, national government, and why these three different levels matter.
Respond to one thing, because I think the 2017 elections were really encouraging to me in that it felt like it was going to be a replay of 2016. If you looked at the Virginia race, particularly the issues that were being discussed in that race was all about Confederate monuments and sanctuary cities and guns and felons voting legally. But the outcome was very, very different. And I think what it showed is that the diversity of the Democratic Party is a strength, not a weakness. And that has always been what I've thought, but I think that it was reinforced in 2017 when you saw, the first trans legislator elected and the first Latinas elected, and not just in Virginia, but in New Jersey, first black
Minnesota.
lieutenant governor, St. Paul, first black mayor, Helena, Montana, first black mayor. I mean, all across the country, all of these things. And it's like, that is actually the roadmap to victory. There
right,
will be more of these people.
Yeah, but the DNC doesn't get it because they're still trying to chase sort of kind of these white working class voters. So I think the local DNCs are trying to understand the diversity that works. But I
Well,
think the larger Tom Perez, Keith Ellison, not sure about
No,
that.
well, so I'll push back on that one because I actually think they care a lot about it. And the question is, though, that the DNC is also has a lot of rebuilding to do. But to be that as it may, because that ends up all being an inside baseball.
We'll have that one over
Yeah, we'll be
over some
drinking
wine
that
because
one.
I have some thoughts.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of inside baseball, but I think the point is really critically important, and it's also one that to your point about local elections and the importance of local elections on things like what are state laws on voting rights. I mean, those are local elections, and on things like what are our electoral maps look like, and there's no question that the Republican Party has been significantly better over decades at focusing on building that up, and the Democratic Party has largely ignored it historically. So
and also
that's
putting
not
provisions on the ballot to galvanize particular people to
Correct.
come out during
Correct.
certain election years, right? So we've
No
seen
question.
California always is really strategic about when they'll have certain provisions on the ballot. And also we have to be really vigilant because how they're written is specific, right? So I just remember touching down in California when Prop 8 was on the ballot about marriage equity.
Yep.
And so the first thing I said when I saw my friends, I was like, yay, Prop 8. And they're like, no, we're voting no on Prop 8. I was like, no, but you believe in marriage equity. And they're like, right, so we vote no. So, I mean, how these legislatures make it such that they put it on the ballot, which is confusing. And it's like, if I have a PhD and I'm a little confused about the wording, we know that there are several costs to voting. So if someone is going there and they have to read this for the first time because they haven't gone online to look at a sample ballot and to think about these questions and to sit there over a glass of wine and talk to their friends about how you're going to vote for certain provisions on the ballot, then that's just another way that we create barriers for people to participate.
Absolutely. So I wanted to. So we've talked. We probably need to talk a little bit more about the impact of demographic change and immigration on even how and why we think about making it hard to vote, and how much of a myth that is. And as of course we've obviously covered race and immigration, and this is a great example about how it's making voting harder for a lot of citizens because we're using So I think we should pause on that for a little bit, and then come back to, we've also talked about criminal justice issues and felony disenfranchisement being one where, the Virginia move also made a difference in the election. Not so the right thing to do, but also creating more voice for some of the electorate. So can we just jump off with, and Chrissy, you started on immigration and the intersections there, but what do you think are the most important points for us to understand about demographic change, immigration, and how that's driving the bad conversation we're having on voting rights? And then Ari, I want to turn to you on that.
Yeah, I think it's just a real fear of particular individuals coming into the voting polls. I think what will be fascinating, just to go back to your question about immigration in 2018, to see where our Puerto Rican brothers and sisters settle.
Florida, New York.
Yeah, so we know that there's a natural Florida-New York connection just based on, social networks, economic networks, political networks, family networks that are strong. But it'll be fascinating to see if Puerto Ricans start to settle in sort of non-traditional places, just because, there are jobs in certain parts of the country. I mean, many people don't want to live there, but there are jobs to be had. To see if they will begin to sort of settle in places that could change, even on local elections. Certain
Well, even
partisan.
our discourse seems to forget, as we talk about Hurricane Marina, that Puerto Rico is actually part of the United States.
Same with St. Croix and St. Thomas that
yes.
are still, essentially in the dark as well. And we're not talking about those 150,000 American citizens. So with immigration, I do think that, when you look at this particular administration, though, Voter Fraud Commission targeting, though, people of color. I mean, this particular president and his administration definitely want to make it easier for people from white countries to come here, to become citizens, and to vote, because it goes back to this, sort of creating new white people. And I think that there's a real fear that many immigrants will automatically be Democrat, which isn't always the case. So I was fascinated. I really thought that in 2016, Asian Americans would would just be like the courted group by both parties. Because if you look at the data over the years, Asian Americans on the national level and in lots of local places, they don't really have a deep bond with the Democratic Party or a deep bond with the Republican Party, but they're the fastest growing voting population. So why isn't a particular party courting them? I know it takes time, energy, their cost to it, and there just seems to be a lack of interest. Going back to Ari's earlier point about really bringing in new people to the fold. The only people who really bring in new people to the fold are insurgent candidates, a la Barack Obama, people who have to essentially fight the establishment, right, to try and carve in a space. Other than that, you go back to the same pool. But if you're a new candidate, and I always tell my students this, if you're running for office and you don't have a naturally built-in base and you're running against an incumbent, you got to get new people to sign up to vote. And that's where I think demographics come in. Unfortunately, I don't know if the time, effort, and infrastructure are really there, especially for 2018, to really try and get these new people to the polls.
Well, I just think that, so much of the voter fraud rhetoric that was targeting African Americans in the Jim Crow era is now targeting Latinos. I mean, it's not like they've given up on disenfranchising black voters. They've just added Latinos and others to the mix. But I mean, when Donald Trump says, millions of people voted illegally, he's talking about millions of undocumented people. And we'll leave aside the fact that didn't happen, and it also just makes no logical sense why someone would risk deportation to vote. But I think it's kind of a twofer for them, because number one, they're talking about illegal voting, and then number two, they're talking about people who are here illegally. So I mean, they've Breitbart and the like have kind of figured out how to blend these two constituencies into one, and I think it's proved quite politically effective. But it's pretty obvious what they're doing. On the felon disenfranchisement part, I think we have a situation where 6 million people in this country can't vote because of felon disenfranchisement laws, and it's not just outright bans. It's also things like you can't vote when you're on parole or probation, or you have to pay back all your fines, and we know how difficult that can be. But I do see it as an area where their increased attention is making a big difference. So there is probably going to be a referendum on the ballot in Florida in 2018 for a constitutional amendment to end that state's felon disenfranchisement law. Of the 6 million people that can't vote nationally because of these laws, 1.7 million live in Florida. So just a huge number of disenfranchised people live in Florida, the quintessential swing state, and 1 in 5 African Americans can't vote in Florida because of this law. And I see it as an area where criminal justice and voting rights overlap. And as someone who writes about this, I'm always looking for ways to try to make voting relate to other issues that people care about. And I think this is a really, really good one for a lot of younger people that kind of came up politically through Black Lives Matter, to see like this is one of the next steps that you can take in terms of tangible things that will shift power. And so we've seen a lot of organizing around that. I think that's a ballot initiative that can get some people to the polls as well. And so I think that's the kind of thing we have to think more of in terms of, okay, like, because my whole thing is like you have to be as aggressive in thinking about how to expand voting rights as the people who are trying to limit voting rights are. Because like literally every day I hear a new proposal for like, this is how we're going to try to disenfranchise people. And so like I want to see the same type of thing from the other side about this is how we can expand political participation.
And I wanted to open it up for questions. And so as people are, do we have our person? Yeah, thank you for our traveling mic. We'll start to share one. But just to note that as we're talking about these issues, it's certainly been the case in the United States that white men who didn't own land had to fight for the right to vote. And then women, of course, white women had to fight for the right to vote. And then Black people, although technically, legally, we've talked about all the barriers to actually voting, but that it's been something that generation after generation has had to fight for in a country that actually elevates the importance of this as a democratic practice, and to the point of this discussion, retrenchment, but also that every single time we take these steps to disenfranchise people of color, as we've talked about, the impact always includes people who are white. And I think we should not lose that is fundamentally part of what happens when we, as a country, work to exclude some, is that we end up hurting all. Do we? Yes.
Couple things. First of all, it was twice in the 1800s when the winner of the Electoral College, who lost the popular vote, became president. Also, just remember that in addition to the 3 million voters who voted for Hillary over Trump, there were 7 million who voted for the two third-party candidates. Ari should know that if you want to absentee ballot, if you want to absentee vote in New York, you can go down to the Board of Elections. I think it's couple weeks before the election, up until the day before the election, and vote in person in like 10 minutes. It's very easy. I'm wondering whether
But that is its own cost for low-income people who have a hard time taking time away from work. And we
Right.
have about 46% of New York City residents, for example, struggle to pay the bills each month. So it's, I don't think so you're absolutely right. But I would just say New York State is way behind the modern times in terms of how we think about people voting. I don't think there's really much debate around experts who study access to the polls on how badly we're doing in the state. But your
Right.
point is well taken.
It's amazing to me that tomorrow Roy Moore might win, even though he thinks that blacks and women shouldn't have the vote. But my question is, can't there be some court cases in Alabama because of the DMV closings? I mean, people have to get driver's licenses. Couldn't there be court cases?
Yeah, well, with regards to Alabama, the DMV closures were reversed because there was such a public outcry. And so this was an example of where popular mobilization actually had an impact, even in Alabama. The hours are still pretty bad, quite honestly. Some offices are only open one day a month. And I found that interesting because in the civil rights era, voter registration offices were only open one day a month in places like Selma. And then what you would do is the registrars would just take a 6-hour lunch break. And so there was your one day a month was just gone. And so, I mean, sometimes people were like actively disenfranchised, and sometimes it was just like they were really good at using their bureaucracies to just slow everything down for a long, long time, too.
I might argue if you're open one day a month, you're not open. Yeah. You know, I mean, because we know, especially for wage earners, I mean, that means, let's just say you're open a Tuesday from 9 to 5, one time out of the month. I need to restructure my entire life around this one particular Tuesday, somehow get there, which is a cost, sort of monetarily and otherwise, and then hope that you don't take a 2-hour lunch break or a 3-hour lunch break, or that I can actually survive the line, which obviously there will be one if anyone's ever been to the DMV, right? And you're open one day a week. So every single person, and these are people who aren't just trying to register the vote, they just need to go to the DMV. Like, there's certain things that just need to happen at the DMV. So, I mean, yes, it's technically open. It's sort of like when Bobby Jindal didn't close any hospitals in New Orleans or in Louisiana, but he would keep them with like one doctor and 2 nurses. Like, you close the hospital.
And just in terms, so the Alabama's voter ID law is also being challenged in court. I'm less hopeful about what's going to happen in the courts over the next 4 years because Donald Trump is appointing judges. But still, it is being challenged in court. In New York, it's just it constantly pains me about our voting laws because I was in North Carolina during the federal trial challenging their voter suppression laws, and the lawyer for North Carolina was invoking New York as a reason why North Carolina could cut early voting. He said, "Why do we need to have 3 weeks of early voting if North Carolina doesn't have, if New York doesn't have any?" And leave aside the fact that we don't have the same history as North Carolina, but it's crazy to me that we don't have early voting, we don't have election day registration, we don't have no excuse absentee ballots, we don't have automatic registration. I mean, so many states like Oregon and California and Minnesota are going in progressive directions, and we're going in the opposite. I mean, we had 100,000 people purged in Brooklyn, and nobody even knows why. You had to register 9 months beforehand to vote, to be in the primaries. I mean, it's just crazy to me. And so, like, that's one thing that people here who plan to stay in New York can tangibly do is, you know, try to advocate for a better voting system so we're not 48th in voter turnout in 4 or 8 years.
Thanks. So a lot of you talked a little bit about local elections and the sort of firsts that we're seeing in local elections, and a lot of like local organizing has gone into those things, right? So I honestly don't believe the Democratic Party has a lot to do with the folks that we've seen really rise up and push through in local elections. I think a lot of that has been local organizing. A lot of that has been Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives and other sort of local folks being like, actually, we're just gonna get these trash people out of here, right? We need some new stuff going on. And so I guess my question to you is, how do we take those spaces, right? The spaces where organizing has really pushed voters to get out and go to the polls and make that into a larger movement next year when we're looking at midterms, and then look at it again with whoever we end up with on the ballot for 2020. Because I think that those steps are really what's going to make a difference in places. I lived in Wisconsin for 4 years. I went to Lawrence, and Appleton does this thing where they split Lawrence up. Lawrence is a campus. It's tiny. It's like 1,400 students. But they split the campus up into all these different districts because they didn't want too many liberals in one district, right? And so that's, sort of the opposite of packing. And that's been on the books. They got the sundown town part off the legislation, but that part's still there, right? And so what are ways that like local spaces can start to move towards organizing around larger elections to really A, get incumbents out of the spaces, but B, really get people engaged around voting? Because there's a lot of hopelessness that I'm seeing.
I would say, I view it as a snowball, right? Because you also need certain people in a pipeline to sort of build up, right? Unless you go with the millionaire model, which is like, okay, I'm a millionaire, so I'm just gonna run for governor. I support organizations like, yeah, they're activist organizations, but like Emily's List gets pro-choice Democratic women, right? But I support Higher Heights, which is Black women electing Black women with Black female money. So like around the country, we're invested in sort of getting Black women in like school board president, county clerk, the DAs, right? We know Color of Change is like getting DAs. Georgia. So like, Stacey Abrams is, I'm all in for Georgia 2018, the gubernatorial race, because if she wins, she'll be the first Black female governor in the history of the United States, right? But the Democratic Party is putting up a white Stacey, right? So it's like two Stacey's, both in the legislature. Stacey Abrams is the minority House leader, but the Democratic Party was like, well, it's fine that she has a Democratic challenger, and there's a white woman who's self-funded named Stacey. So this is also where we see the institutions sort of going against kind of like these grassroots movements. And definitely Stacey Abrams is part of an institution. She's part of the Democratic Party. But I think that, for me at least, I consider myself, I've been thinking a lot more about like political tithing. So I think some of us in this room probably come from traditions where, you give to your church, your synagogue, your mosque, whatever it may be. And that's how you were raised, and whether it's a percentage or whether it's what your family could afford, that's what you do. But I've been trying to think about ways to invest in the political process by giving to not the DNC, but a grassroots organization that is in Appleton, Wisconsin, that's working against the drama that they're seeing, right? And so it takes a little bit of time. I always try and remind people, it's like, how much time do you watch trash TV, right? So if you're watching The Real Housewives of Nowheresville, right, if that's 55 minutes, then you need to be doubling that to doing some sort of political research, right? So like whatever garbage TV that you're watching, and listen, we all love garbage TV. I'm not judging. However, you just need to double that time to really do the research and invest in organizations at a local level that are sort of eyeing people. Because we're seeing these wins, right? We're seeing young people knock off sort of people who are hypertenured and they're over it. But there are a lot of people who also, they need money. Like money's not a bad thing, right? And so I've also been trying to encourage people. It's like, I didn't go to law school. I don't judge people who go to law school. I don't judge my students who go to law school. I just tell them, you are going to make money and I'm going to ask you to give it to a good cause. I'll do the research, but like money's not a bad thing, right? Especially if you can finance the revolution. Like someone's got to pay for it, right? So I think that also is like helping people realize like, you may be a hedge fund manager. You're not really in the streets. That's fine. But when there's a net neutrality, protest, pay for some people to go to DC and protest. Like you can do that. So I mean, I think it's just also getting people to understand that it's not just electoral politics. It's also the only way I think a democratic society works is if you have activist politics along with electoral politics, because both of them sort of play off of one another.
I have a 3-year-old, so I just watch Moana now. So it's good. Yeah, you should watch it 300 times. I mean, the thing is particularly for local elections, not that many people vote in them. So if you can get new people out, you can change those races a lot easier than you think. That's what we learned in Virginia. In Virginia, Democrats ran candidates for 40 of 100 state legislative seats 2 years ago, or whenever the last election was. This time they ran them in 90 of 100 races. And they won races no one even thought was winnable because the margins were so small. You saw people winning by 20, 30, 40, 60, 70, 100 votes. And so that was a real testament to, that your vote does matter and that these local elections matter. The other thing is, if you don't like the Democratic Party, it can be reinvented. Like, it's the fact the Democratic Party is so weak right now means there's an opening for people to change it. And some stuff's not going to change, right? Because of money in politics, the Democratic Party is always going to be beholden to its own set of big donors. Some stuff is not going to change without structural reforms. But all of the different groups, whether it's local Black Lives Matter groups, or whether it's local Dreamer groups, or whether it's local indivisible groups, I mean, they can all, either through the Democratic Party or just outside the Democratic Party, they can all have a big impact in upcoming local elections.
Thank you. Would you speak to the balance of power between ALEC and what you're referring to as this conglomerate of grassroots organizations?
And everyone knows what ALEC is? Okay, so who wants to do your...
I can start it. So ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. They pair state legislators with corporate interests. So literally Coca-Cola, Walmart, the NRA will just write bills and give it to state legislators, and state legislators, who most of whom are poorly paid and work part-time, will just pass them. And some Democrats are part of ALEC, but a lot of Republicans, almost all Republicans are, and they have passed, for example, the Stand Your Ground laws in Florida and the voter ID bills in Wisconsin and any number of anti-environmental laws all across the country. So this is a mechanism for corporate interests, no matter who's in power, but particularly when Republicans are in power, to get their laws passed and literally write them. And I mean, there's no comparison between ALEC on the right and like the indivisible movement on the left. I mean, Democrats are always going to be more decentralized, I think, and more into the small d process. But it is true that in ways that, I mean, no one even knew who ALEC was until a few years ago, and they'd been around since the 1970s. So it just goes to show you, like, the ways that Republicans have built power, and also realizing that you can buy a state a lot cheaper than you can buy the presidency. And then once you get them in there, not only that, but if you can get your people elected and then you can gerrymander them, it doesn't even cost a lot of money because they're in safe districts. So, I mean, then you're talking about, it's actually pretty easy to take this stuff over. So I think that there's an increasing awareness that this is what's been happening, and that there has to be some sort of more structured institutions, probably on the left side of the aisle, when they take power, to try to get some similar stuff through on the other side.
I think this does go back to Ari's point that, especially in primaries, so few people are getting in, you know? So even if, say, a Republican is kind of owned by ALEC, you know, I think that there are lots of good Republicans who aren't necessarily owned yet, right? And maybe they won't be. So getting them, you know, a Democrat isn't necessarily going to win in a hardcore red district, but you can find a legitimate Republican to run against someone. I mean, we send people to Albany with 10,000 votes, and they're in charge of hundreds of billions of dollars, and our reproductive rights, and our children's education, and all these other things, right? So I think it's really getting people a lot more civically engaged, but there's so many elected officials who do not necessarily want you civically engaged beyond November 8th, right? Or November 4th, or whatever day that is. And I think that that's a real disservice to American democracy, but we've gotten there. I will also say money is great in politics, but it's not the only thing. I mean, we've seen people knock off candidates who have way more money, right? Because you can galvanize people ideas. And I think we're in a great moment right now because there's so many young people where I'm like, hey, guess what? You're not going to get Social Security. Give up the ghost. I might not even get it. And I've been paying into it for 25 years, right? I think a lot of young people are making connections where it's like, why am I paying $60,000 a year for college and I might not have a job, like for a long, long time, right? Why is it that, sort of I can't necessarily buy a house? Like, why is it that if I wasn't born into a family with a particular last name, then I have very limited chances of, either making it successful in office or just like making it, right? So I think that there's a level of frustration that a lot of young people are sort of tying their economic circumstances to what's going on in DC. And it's like, right, but they know that you didn't vote for them. So what is their incentive to ever pay attention to you, right? They vote for the little grannies who go out there every single primary and every single general, and they know every single person who votes for them. Now, I don't know if this story is true or anecdotal or not, but, when Michael Bloomberg ran for mayor, right, there was the first time, not the second or the third time. But there's the electoral map, right? And there was the snow removal map. And people would say that the snow removal map in the 5 boroughs perfectly laid over the electoral map, whether you voted for Michael Bloomberg or not, right? Because he knew that highly participatory districts go to the polls, whether they were Democrats who voted for him or whatever. So you could see, I'm on the Upper West Side near Columbia. We are a very highly participatory district. There is not a flake of snow that falls without streets. Buses have the chains. Everyone is prepared for us, right? Whereas when there was the blizzard and he was in Bermuda, remember that one, right? And there were other communities that were under snow for 3 weeks, right? And we were just walking the streets like, oh my, it was a little brisk snow. And so that's the way all politicians are. They respond to the people who respond to them. And it's unfortunate, it's unfair, but we actually have the power to change that pretty easily by staying vigilant and letting them know that we have the power to get them in or out.
We didn't talk a lot about money and politics, obviously, but that relates directly to the ALEC because it's the organizing, it's the money, and then it's the legislative proposals that are built from that focus on local. And I think it's not that we don't have grassroots organizing. We have a lot less money going to grassroots organizing and then funding the types of candidates and then having that pipeline of everything from the actual policies we're fighting for connected to where the money is flowing and then connecting to the organizing work that happens around it.
And that's probably one of the reasons why the Democratic Party hasn't done more to invest in Black women, right? It's like there's not an ExxonMobil of Black women to fund all the organizations, right?
Right. And I think, a lot of these grassroots organizations don't take corporate money, right? Because then you're beholden to writing legislation that you might not agree with. So I think it's up to us if we want to change things. I mean, I think a lot of people go with the lowest hanging fruit, right? So after the election, everyone and their grandmother donated to the ACLU. It's like, well, or like the Red Cross after a crisis. It's like, they're not the only game in town, but a lot of people, it's easy to do that. But, do the research. Like,
in defense of the ACLU, one of the good things that the ACLU did with their money is they sent it to the states.
Right.
I'm not an accountant for the ACLU. I don't know, but from talking to my friends there, they have 50 state chapters. So that
They go to their chapter.
so that was important to just
like $60 million in a week.
totally. But what I'm saying is just the idea of investing in the states was something that like people can learn from. Like if
Yeah, and I'll add, full disclosure, I am a board member on. Okay, I was honest. I was transparent. Center for Popular Democracy, which works nationally and now has a network of grassroots organizing groups in 34 states. But they deliver back $1 for every dollar they raise nationally. They deliver a dollar back to local, and that's for local organizing and local fights. But that is a fairly unique model of national group in a network with local organizing groups, and it is explicitly in an effort to build up racial justice organizing. But the point is, when you have a Citizens United that has like opened the spigots for dark money in politics, essentially, and we don't match it very well in terms of money, then I agree that there's a lot more we can do, but it's just to say we also don't link up those 3 things explicitly as much as we, I think, could or should.
Yes, can you speak to the Barack Obama and Eric Holder Yeah, because they're supposedly doing something against gerrymandering, and also I thought I had read Hillary Clinton was going to take some of that $100 million she had left over, or some of that money she had left over, to also influence election for midterm. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Um, I'm more familiar with the first point, the second. So I think that I haven't talked to him about this, but I have talked to Eric Holder about this, and I think that Barack Obama believes that his greatest political failing was not investing more in the Democratic Party and not paying more attention to state-level races. And he doesn't want that to happen again. And they saw that, number one, Republicans invested very successfully in winning state legislatures, and then number two, invested very effectively in keeping power by gerrymandering them. And it was such an unfair asymmetric arms race. And so basically, I think Holder and Obama and others want to start now before 2020 so they can start getting this operation on track, meaning that they're going to file lawsuits now. They're going to try to elect more state level candidates and try to get in a position for when the 2020 election comes along that they can either be in power or be closer to power so they can have some influence on this contest. And some of it's going to rely on external factors, like what the courts say about gerrymandering. But just paying attention to this, just running more candidates, investing more money in local races, having better people to focus on these local areas. I mean, I think that can start to make a difference. So I think this is really smart that they figured out that there was this void and there was something they could do about it. And Virginia is a great example where, now you have a Democratic governor in Virginia through 2021, meaning that he's going to have veto power over whatever the maps will be. So even if Democrats don't take back the legislature, and there's a good chance they will take it back, but even if they don't take it back, you're going to get some sort of compromise map passed.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest political failings of Barack Obama is that he lost over 9,000 Democratic seats during his tenure, across the country. And these are small offices all the way up to state houses and gubernatorialships. So I do think that a lot more people are paying attention, slowly but surely. But I think by the time the census comes up in the conversation of gerrymandering, it won't be a word that the vast majority of Americans have never heard of before. And I think it's also falls upon our elected officials to explain to their constituencies what's at stake. And I can't speak to the Hillary Clinton piece because I'm not too sure about her money situation.
I can't speak to the Hillary Clinton piece either, but I will say that I don't think we should ignore the fact that the Obama administration made a principled decision to fight for healthcare reform, recognizing that they would probably lose the House by demanding that, you can disagree, but I'm telling you about the conversations internally about the electoral map. So we're going to hear it from Derek because he's making face. No, I'm not suggesting that wasn't to that wasn't to disagree with the point about investment locally and state level, but it was just to say that there was a discussion, an explicit discussion within the White House about whether or not to push forward on healthcare reform, which, as you remember, was both a pillar of the promise that he ran on, but also something that was extremely important for folks, and decided to stick with that legislative agenda and ask Democrats to stay within the coalition and pass the legislation, recognizing that it would have an impact on the midterm elections.
And I mean, this is something that FDR tried and LBJ tried and Bill Clinton tried, and no one could do it. And so it's a huge, we can't sort of, underestimate the success of the ACA because this is something that Democrats have tried to do for basically 100 years.
I also think it's true that Barack Obama his post-partisan identity worked very well for him and very badly for everyone else when he was in power.
So Trump seems like something different than McCain, than Romney, than Bush, etc. He has more of a fascist agenda. But that said, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find that blacks have fared better under Democrats in terms of inequality than Republicans. And I guess I'm bringing that up in the context of the disregard for the points that were raised earlier about not making overtures towards their base, which is black women and black men, but rather taking that electorate for potentially granted. But also I want to invoke the Du Bois essay as the 1932 essay, I believe, where he explained why he was not voting for Democrats or Republicans. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there in terms of, seems like we have a narrative about some of the benefits of voting Democrat, and it seems clear with this current administration, but in a longer term horizon, is there any other strategy with regards to racial inequity than the traditional one that does not seem to have been working?
So I would say that, obviously, I think the Democratic Party definitely has and continues to take Black folks for granted at the polls, but by no means are the legislative agendas similar when it comes to Democrats and Republicans. And I think that Trump has magnified that, but across several states, Republicans have not necessarily been great for Black people for a host of class policies, racialized policies, things I would consider racist policies, depending on where you live. This is just racist policies on steroids. I mean, if you have people with tiki torches and saying that they're very fine people, we're serious. This is 2017, right? And not 1957. So yeah, that also brings up, there's the first question from the woman earlier, which was, 7 million people voted for someone not Democrat or Republican. And that always brings up this space about where does another party factor in, right? 'Cause it's not the Green Party necessarily, it's not this party or that. But we have seen alternative parties, make inroads on state levels, right? Was Jesse Ventura was an independent. He's also a millionaire and had, name recognition because he was a famous wrestler. But I think that there are some people having conversations about what would a third party look like. Now, in the past, we've had two scenarios, right? A third party tries to come up and they either get subsumed by one of the major parties, or they rise up large enough where they subsume one of the major parties. We don't have parties in our Constitution, but we also, as Americans, think of things in a very sort of NFL, red versus blue, right? Most of us grew up going to a school where there's like color wars, like the last day of school, it's like the green team versus the white team or whatever it may be. So unfortunately, we've made this contact sport between these two teams. And that doesn't necessarily give a lot of breathing room for third parties. There's also a lot of money that's not invested in third parties, right? So parties still matter because they still do these institutional mechanisms that kind of help you get your word out. And it's a shortcut for a lot of voters, right? If you say you're a Democrat, I can make some assumptions about what you believe in and who you are on the ballot. If you are from some obscure party, I can't necessarily make those same assumptions. So that means the cost of me finding out about you and the cost to you getting your message to me is a lot more difficult. And so that's why I think the third party movement has been challenged for quite some time.
We're at time. I just want to add one thought, which is not an answer to what is a very tough question. So I won't pretend I have an answer. I come from, my mom was very active in third-party politics most of her adult life. So I've watched that process up close and personal. But what I will say is, I think our issues of race, and maybe this is a good capstone comment for the class, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to make a final comment, is I don't think having more parties in and of itself, that's not to say it's not something we should consider, but in and of itself gets to what we're trying to get to with racial equity. That ultimately it really is about our organizing, our participation, our knowledge, our investments, and our ability to build a different consensus in this country, whether we have 2 parties or 5 parties. And I think it will be tough in all instances and critically important and far from impossible. But that's just actually a parting thought about how hard racial equity work is in the United States and how complex as we've discussed it in this course, because as we see, we are not in a static moment of developing or understanding even what we mean by race and who we mean by racialized, except I think I'll also, for my parting comment, and then I want to turn it over to Derek and Michelle, the one true constant is that Black remains at the bottom. And by bottom, I don't necessarily mean all the demographic details of poverty, because we know that's not necessarily true depending on where we're looking, but that in terms of the concepts of racial hierarchy, it's usually a fight around not Blackness.
And I would add, first of all, thank you to our guests for tonight. And Both Ari and Christina have been a capstone to an incredible semester where we have all learned a lot. And one of the things that I was reflecting on last night as I was thinking, this is the last class, I don't want it to be over. Right? I put my dean hat on and I say, this should not be over. And I really want to encourage you all that are students that are here. We've been welcoming of everybody because everybody needs to be in this conversation, but you all are enrolled. And those of you that are enrolled, we want to hear what you want to talk about. We want to hear what kind of courses you want to get more of. We want to hear if this is a discussion that you want to continue and how we should be continuing. The how is actually a really important piece to the puzzle. I think also in thinking back over the course of these 11 weeks, it is startling how our history is a complete revisionist history. And we have talked about it in so many different elements, and even the foundational element of, you know, what is this land about? Who owned this land? How did we get this land? And then we're trying to stop other people from coming into it. And it is really a very, it's slightly crazy, actually. So again, I want to thank you all for your participation. This has been incredible. Thank you to my colleagues, Maya and Derek, who I will always co-teach with you.
I mean, it's hard to follow Michelle. I'm just going to say one tiny thing also, in addition to thanking my colleagues, but the people who supported this class, I don't know everybody by name because my memory's horrible, but I know you, and you did a lot of stuff, period. So, you know, very grateful for that. And of course, we probably created more questions than we had answers in the class, but I think there's one theme that is clear, and that is we need to evolve to a system where people are empowered rather than extracted from or oppressed in any way.
And in closing, we really want to thank the Provost's office who co-sponsored this, along with Milano, of course, in the Henry Cohen program, but also marketing and communications that helps support with live streaming. Remember, every last session that we've had was live streamed and it's archived. So if there's anything you missed, please feel free to go back up and watch it, but also share it, because this is a conversation we hope can instruct and, as my esteemed colleague said, continue the conversation. So thank you.